started by introducing Beth. Beth, hi, JD. Beth, did you want to go ahead and introduce yourself to our group?
Sure. My name is Beth Dunning, and I'm the Director of Community Development for Nevada Rural Housing. I've been with the agency for 9 years, all in the development department. We try to develop 1 to 2 projects per year. We've done a lot of rehabs, some new construction, mostly LIHTC, low-income housing tax credits. So I'm happy to be here and see if I can help you out.
Hey, thank you so much. So JD and Hetty, do you think it would be helpful if I kind of shared that pro forma with the highlighted, and then maybe you guys can just get started, and this will be kind of an informal discussion. I know we have had some presentations, more formal presentations in the past, but for this one, we're going to kind of go through some line items on a pro forma, and Beth, JD, and Hetty will have some informal discussion about what they are and why they're important. And then you guys are welcome to join in the conversation or ask questions anytime. And we'll just keep it chiller mode today. I'll go ahead and share here. All right, can you see that pro forma? Excellent. But yeah, so why don't we just go ahead and kick off, and maybe Beth, can you maybe just give a high level kind of overview of what pre-development means and like what it is?
Sure. So pre-development is all of the fun things that we get to do before we get into actually building things. So typically it starts with your application process, and once you are awarded funding, then it goes through to your financial closing. And then that's the point when you would actually start spending your construction money and building the project. So these are all of the things that have to be done as part of your due diligence to get started on the project, either for the application or to satisfy questions and concerns from the investor partner, if that's what you're using.
I'm muted. I'm on mute. Thank you so much. Does anybody have any questions about that so far? Awesome. So why don't we just jump right
I did have a question for Beth. Are there things that you do even outside of an application round? Like you have to have an idea of what you're trying to do in the first place to even apply. So is there like pre-dev in your mind, or what are there some things even outside of submitting for funding?
Yeah, and pre-development, it starts before the application. That's a great point, because if you don't know what you're going to build and you don't have an idea of where you're putting it or whether it's going to fit into the community or fill the need, then you don't really know what to put into your application. So a lot of times some of these items start way before that. So as I'm looking down this list of the yellow items, a lot of times you're looking at the property first. So you might be looking at a rehab, or you might be looking at a piece of vacant land, and you're going to be asking yourself, what is needed for this area? So a market study has a lot to do with what is the need in the area. An environmental and a survey, those things have to do with the land itself. So if you're looking at acquiring a piece, if it's not something that's already within your ownership realm, then you're going to be asking yourself, okay, we need an appraisal because we need to figure out, is the price that we're paying for this piece of property, whether it's vacant or already has something on it, is it worth the amount of money that we're paying for it? On the environmental is very important. You always want to do your phase 1 study prior to taking ownership, because if you do a phase 1 and you find out anything beforehand, any cleanup, if you run into any major issues down the road, a lot of that falls to the previous owner. You can get more funds if it happened to the property prior to you taking ownership and you checked it out prior to taking ownership. And then your survey, a lot of that gets important, because We had a piece of property that we looked at one time, and it already had apartments on it and it looked great. We got our survey back and the property line went through half of 2 buildings. So before we took ownership, we were talking to the seller and saying, hey, you got to clean up your title. And we wouldn't have known that if we hadn't done the survey. So yes, you're doing many of these things in advance of your application so that you have a better application. And then you may have to do updates and follow up on it. And all of this stuff does get submitted to an investor partner or a construction loan partner. They ask all of these things as well. So you're just getting them done ahead of time.
Thanks, Beth. The one thing I'd add is I think this is like the riskiest part of the process, because this is money that you might put 150,000 out and to get some of this done. And then it's like, actually, this isn't viable. And there's no way to really recoup that. So this is probably the riskiest part of the process. And it's also why, again, when we were talking about the pro forma, you want to get a developer fee, because where else are you going to get the money to do this? You can't necessarily apply for these pre-dev funds. So part of getting paid from your last project is so you can invest in the next project. So I think it's a good thing for us. We've been thinking through different line items, and having unrestricted funds from a developer fee lets you invest in your next potential project.
Right. And you're using that money in advance of the closing, because if you're doing a 9% or a 4% project, if you're using the tax credits and some of the other methods of financing, you're going to get this money back, but you don't get it back until closing. So just as an example of the high risk, because that's a great point, we have a project that we're doing in Mesquite right now. It's 96 units. We were out because it's a large project, and because of COVID and HMNI screwing up some of the funding with NHD, a lot of projects got delayed. We were out about $1.5 million until we finally hit the closing. So it can be, we knew it was a solid project. We knew it was going to get there, but we were out. There was probably 6 to 9 months that we were a little extended further than we'd like to be, with $1.5 million of pre-dev, and we got it all back. But it is something that you put out. So you use your developer fees to fund your way through until you get to the next step.
Awesome. Should we start on the list? At the top, build acquisition.
Sure. So building and land acquisition, that's sort of self-explanatory. That's any cost that you're going to use to pay for the property. So if you have to buy a piece of land or you have to buy a building, those costs go in that first section. There are cases where we have acquired a property just for the transfer of debt. So for example, you have a property that may have existing home debt, or it may have existing USDA debt on it. You can transfer the property and there's no actual money that goes to the seller, but the amount of money that you're assuming in debt can also fill in those 2 spaces for acquisition.
I think for this group, because these are, primarily for supportive housing and community organizations who, maybe are pursuing owning and operating their own property, but aren't, developers at the core. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of getting land donations or partnering with like the county or jurisdictions around building like projects that are, aligning with kind of targeting community goals like ending homelessness?
Yeah. Land costs and the acquisition costs are definitely the most expensive portion of trying to get a development off the ground. So anytime you can get land donated is the best. You want to keep that acquisition area as close to zero as possible if you can. Like I said, for acquisition, when we acquire a property and we assume it just for the debt, that we take on the debt and it comes in as a source and it comes in as a use at the same time. So when you're talking about your pro forma and your sources and uses, they essentially take each other out. They zero each other out. So if you can get land donated from, say, a city realizes that it needs some supportive housing, and they have a piece of land that will work, and you can get them to donate that for zero, then that takes that acquisition, keeps it at zero, and then you have much more money to spend on the rest of the project. A lot of times on this type of funding that we're using, it's counter to what most people believe a performer should come up with. If you were working private sector and you're doing a for-profit project, you're going to look at what you want to build, and you're going to say, it's going to cost me $2 million to build this building. And then you're going to factor everything in around that, and you're going to come up with that amount of money. But because of the way tax credits work and some of these funding sources work, you're actually looking at the amount of money that's available to you, and you're saying, okay, how far can I take that money? How many units can I build with it? And they subtract out all of these soft costs, like this pre-development stuff we're doing, and then whatever's left over, that's what you have to construct your project with. So it's sort of counterintuitive. It's backwards from what you would do in the private sector. So it's important to keep those acquisition costs and some of those other things as low as you can, so that you can maximize the money for construction.
Mm-hmm.
I'd add too, specific to land acquisition, we did like a little bit of a 101 on LIHTC, and you cannot count land acquisition as part of your basis to get tax credits. So it's this big expense that doesn't help you get more tax credits either. You can sometimes get building acquisition credits, but land acquisition you can't. So that's another reason, to Beth's point, why not only is it expensive, you want to keep it down, is it's difficult to finance in general otherwise. So you have to figure out how to find a deal. Beth, I'm curious, what do you look for in land? If you're like, what is it, like someone says, because a lot of times we're like, hey, I have a piece of land. Do you want to build something here? And you're like, I gotta figure this out. What are the kinds of things that you're considering before you would even, look to get something purchased or donated?
That's a great question. We get that a lot. Even within our agency, we did a whole presentation on it a few months back, because first we do look for free, because free is obviously cheap, right? But free land isn't always good land. For example, in Southern Nevada, we have a piece of property that was donated to us. So there's a charitable trust that knows the type of work that we do, and they believe in affordable housing in Southern Nevada. So they donated a piece of property to us. It's a giant hill on really garbage dirt. And it takes, in order to build on it, it's going to take a significant amount of retaining walls, and we're going to have to move a lot of dirt around. Well, then the city of Mesquite also wanted us to build down there. So they donated us a piece of property, and it was basically a hole in the ground. So we took the dirt from the hillside project and moved it to the hole in the ground and filled it in. And without both donated pieces, our preliminary construction costs for site work would have been astronomical. As it was, the city helped us by donating some trucks to move the dirt from one property to the other, and we got the hole filled in, and it has made the hillside project a little flatter, and it leveled out the project that we're building 96 units on. And it was about $1.5 million in dirt that we were able to get for free, and we got $300,000 from the city to move the dirt. So when you're looking at land, obviously you want it cheap, free if possible, but it also really helps if it's flattish and you don't have to do a lot of dirt moving. It also helps if there's utilities in the area. So if you're working in urban areas, utilities aren't always such a big deal, but when you get into rurals, we find that there's a lot of area in rural development that has great piece of dirt, but there's no utilities to it. So then there's a struggle. You can count, as far as I know, we can count all those costs for utilities and bringing those in, but it just cuts away from what you can do to build the building itself. So if you can find something that already has some utilities to the site, it helps the costs also. Free dirt is good, but it's not always worth free.
Yeah, I think I was thinking about the importance of doing environmental studies too, because if you get free dirt, don't need it and you don't know what's been on there before, like if there's a gas station underneath or something that's going to cause a significant amount of environmental problems that you have to, then it becomes the responsibility of the developer, right? So like they might not tell you when they give you the land because it's up to you to get the environmental study done.
Yeah, so environmental is actually kind of a cool thing. I have learned a lot about it over the years that I've worked here, and I'm not as afraid of it as I was when I first started in this business. Because the first thing you hear, you think environmental, you think phase one, you think that when you're doing your phase two and you're doing testing to actually find out what you're dealing with, whether you're having to do soils testing and find out. So let's back up for a second. A phase one is the first step, and that is a very high level report that looks at historical data from the assessor, they look at mapping, they look at licensing, they look at all of the different things that might have happened on that piece of land. They'll look at your title report. So they check out all this stuff to figure out what has been done on that piece of land prior to you obtaining it. Then if there's anything that's questionable, so if you're looking at a building and it was built, especially if it was built prior to the 1978, I think it is, then they're going to make recommendations that you do additional testing. So the phase two, because there's three parts to environmental. Phase one is high level. Phase two is the actual testing where they go in and they'll do testing of soils. They'll do testing of materials in the building. They will test for radon, asbestos, lead, any issues with the soil, and you're going to get a full report on what the site actually has on it. And then phase three is your mitigation, remediation, abatement. So in many cases, you can remove it depending on what your construction budget is and how much you have for abatement. You can get rid of the materials. It's not an easy thing. The property has to be tented off, and there are strict requirements about keeping everything sealed while they remove the materials. Some materials have to be taken to a special dump where they will take hazardous waste. So it can be very costly, but the cool thing is that in many of our areas, there are brownfields funds that you can access that you can just add into your budget pro forma as an additional source of funding specifically for environmental uses. And you can get your phase one testing paid for in many cases, and you can have testing paid for. And then as long as you weren't the cause of the environmental problem, if you did your phase one prior to acquiring it, they will also help you clean up. Brownfields is not just about negative things like asbestos and lead and hazardous waste that's in the ground, but they're very big on reuse and repurpose. So if there is a vacant piece of land in the middle of the city that nobody wants to build on, they want to see that repurposed and brought to a useful life. So there are funds through brownfields, and there's different ways to access that. You could probably teach a whole class on how to deal with brownfields, but it doesn't have to be this scary thing. You can get assistance and you can get funds added in to help pay for that piece of your construction project.
So Beth, I'm taking notes on brownfield. The one thing I'd add into, particularly because I know folks that are looking to build permanent supportive housing are also probably trying to find project-based vouchers, get some project-based vouchers. And one thing to keep in mind around location is if, depending on your source of funds, you're going to trigger different HUD requirements. And one of those things could be like a site and neighborhood standards, where they're looking at not just the physical land, but they're looking at is it in a minority impacted area? Is it in a low income area? And there's additional considerations that you have to meet in order for like a project-based voucher contract to be signed, or for HUD to approve different things, because you have to prove to them that we're not just building in an area of concentrated poverty without taking into account these things. So another thing when folks say, what about this piece of land? And we look at it, we're like, well, we'd have to do all of these things, and we'd also have to get HUD to say, sure, on the site and neighborhood standards. So
Yes.
That's another, particularly I think for permanent supportive housing, and the layering of HUD funding is another thing to think about if it's worth acquiring.
Yeah, so what I would add to that is, and I was just kind of teaching, I have 2 new team members and I'm teaching them about that. So when you talk about environmental, like my first thought always goes to the phase 1 testing and what is the initial property looking like. But there's an environmental study. So there's ESA, which is your environmental study about what the property looks like. And then there's the environmental review, which is what you're talking about with the vouchers. We also run into that environmental review with USDA funding. So if you're working in a rural area that USDA is a part of it, they will require it too. And yes, that goes further than even what I'm talking about as the environment of the property itself and any kind of hazardous materials, but it also can trigger a SHPO review. So if anybody's heard of the State Historic Preservation Office, they're going to look at the community. They're going to look at the, like you said, the demographics of the community and what you're building in. They're going to look at any historical issues with the site. And that is a whole nother process. So environmental can go a lot of different directions. And there's the ESA and the environmental review, which HUD requires. And you have to get, what I have found typically is that the environmental review comes in more with, once you've hit your application. So you've been awarded your funds, and then you're going to go down the road of now I want to get those vouchers and everything. So I have to meet the requirements to support the vouchers. So then you have to go through the environmental review, because all of that gets signed off and has to go to HUD before they, before the state or whoever is eligible to give you the grant funds for use on the project. So I would say your ESA stuff often happens pre-development or pre-development, and then the environmental review happens between application and financial closing.
I know I'm bouncing around and I'm probably not the best person to decide what order things go in, but the conversation is reminding me of things I learned. And so I was just thinking about the market study, because I was just reading an article this week about, you know, like NIMBYism with the PSH project that's moving forward down here in Las Vegas. And I know that they're having a market study done to try and, you know, make the argument that this is what's needed for this community and that it's, you know, best practice. So that might like look different for PSH and it might like look different for the specific project, but maybe we can talk a little bit about what that means, since it has to happen early in the process.
Sure, a market study is a great place to start. If you go into a community, and we find this a lot in rural areas, because we're working all over this. Our agency covers the 15 rural counties plus rural areas in Washoe and Clark. So we're everywhere. We'll often have a town or a city contact us and say, we need some affordable housing, or we need some supportive housing, whatever the case may be. And they may have it in their head that they need a certain type of housing. But you really do need to do a market study, because housing is it's a cyclical thing. So a housing study is going to look at, how many single family homes there are, how many multifamily homes there are, how many are owned, how many are rented. It's going to look at what the low rents are to the high rents. It's going to take a primary area around your project, and it's going to look at it in depth. If it doesn't find anything similar to what you're doing, it's going to expand its area. It's also going to look at things like, okay, so if there's this many single family homes and there may be this many overburdened homes, they're paying too much for their rents. And if you put in this type of housing, those overburdened people will move, and that opens up your single family homes. And then someone else is going to move into that. So it also talks about, and now the word just flew out of my head, but there's the rate that you're going to be able to occupy your units. And that is really important to your investors, because they want to know if you build 100 units of housing, they want to know how quickly you're going to be able to fill it up, and how long is it going to be before you have no vacancies. How frequently do you think you'll have vacancies? So market studies become really critical. And on the cyclical thing, we often have people tell us that they need family housing. But if we can put in something that's senior or even senior supportive, if you can take the seniors and you can build them some apartments, they might be in homes that they can't afford anymore, or that they can't afford to keep up on their limited incomes if they're restricted to Social Security. And maybe they're just not able to get around anymore. So if you can build a really nice housing complex for seniors, the seniors could then move into that housing. And then you have young families that may be able to move into the houses that the seniors just left. And then that opens up things. So you can see it's kind of a domino and a cycle of housing. So that's something that we've been talking a lot about is, you know, towns think they need one thing, but actually if we give them something else, sometimes that really fills the hole.
Does anybody on the call, you know, maybe Yvette or Britton or JD or Hetty, of course, who've developed, have any comments about the stuff that we've talked about so far, or any personal experiences?
No, this looks good. Again, it's just kind of dealing with the different municipalities, right? So each one, so for example, right now, Tumwa's taking a long time to get plans done. So just being a team that you can ask a lot of questions to and that will guide you through the process is most helpful, because otherwise you're just sitting around, you don't know why things are happening, but it's really common to the folks in the industry and they can explain it and be like your layman's term. So finding a team that you trust and individuals like, I mean, even NHC, right? Just having a group that you can call and say, hey, what does this actually mean, especially for the brown sites, because there's so much grant funding out to clean up. Like there's a super fund to clean up environmental things. So there's a lot of opportunities if you know where to ask.
And I think also I agree. I haven't been involved in this part of it with our construction, but I think like with this group of people, it's nice because if we do have questions, we just have each other to like reach out to. So it's super helpful.
Yeah, definitely a complicated, I mean, I think this shows in a real way, like how many moving parts there are to development. It's like extremely complicated. And so I think that's part of the outcomes or the goals of this learning collaborative, right? Is really to get a better understanding of how many things you have to kind of keep track of and how a single person really can't be the sole developer, right? Like you're really working in a huge team of people with specialized skills. So I love that that's kind of bubbling up for me here. I don't know, where should we go next? Does anybody, I know we only have a half an hour, so maybe if there's certain things that people want to talk about in particular, you can just shout them out just in case we don't get to everything.
I just had a thought. I know we talked about environmental reviews, but just some lessons learned. It's really important to speak to whoever the responsible entity is for their environmental reviews. Like locally here in Reno, it's the city of Reno. So they can definitely walk you through that process and what that's going to look like. But I just think that's an important first step too when thinking about the environmental review and the amount of time that you're looking at to get that completed. They can take quite a bit of time to get reviewed, as we've learned with SHPO and different entities all looking at the same thing. So just some advice to allow plenty of time for those.
And I would say usually if you're required to do a HUD environmental review, you also can't start your project until you get approval. You can't. So if you're like, oh, we'll do it in parallel with a bunch of other stuff, and then you have to stop your general contractor from working for 3 months while you get the environmental review done. It's one of those things where, again, having the team that knows the intricacies of these different things helps you timeline your project out in the right way as well.
Yeah, when you're going through another little thing that I learned a lot of stuff the hard way. It went wrong and then we had to scramble to fix it. But like on your survey and your title reports, that's part of your pre-development that gets done before you get to your closing. Like JD just said, you want to be very careful about what's happening prior to hitting those marks. So just like with the environmental review, you can't start before you finish that. If you have anything going on, if you're buying like a vacant lot and then you want to start construction on it and you're trying to get prepped to get your construction started as quickly as possible, do not touch that site before you hit that closing. We had a project where we had an empty lot and the contractor was itching to get started. So we told him he could go ahead and put like a cargo container out there and some temporary fencing, and all they did was stack it. They landed the container, to start storing some stuff to get ready to start. And they put some panels of temporary fencing up. And what happens is right before you close, title and or somebody else may send someone out to review the site, and they want to make sure that the site looks exactly the way it did when you got your preliminary report. And when they saw the container and the temporary fencing, they said, whoa, now this looks different. So we were supposed to close the next day, and we were delayed by a week while I closed out the contract for temporary fence and closed out a contract for the cargo container and figured out where to move it so that it wasn't on the site, so that the site could go back to having nothing on it, so we could close and then restart. So there's a lot of things. So I guess I have a couple of pieces of advice that I can pass on from my experience. Is when I first started in this, I didn't know anything about any of these things. And I was participating in a lot of phone calls with investors and stuff. And it took me about halfway through the closing period before I realized that I was supposed to be gathering all of these things. And it was my job to be shuffling them around. So one is, it looks intimidating because it's a lot of things, but it's a lot of order a report and you're doing some reviews, but hopefully you have a team and everybody is taking a different part and everybody is looking at them, because everybody has sort of a different perspective that they're coming from. Like our finance people are looking for certain key things. I'm looking for certain key things from construction. Property management is looking at different things on the other side. So if you have a team and you're all taking part in this, it makes it easier, because then you don't have to look at every document solely on your own. Everybody's kind of looking at it from their piece. And it is a lot of moving parts, but if you can sort of look at it and figure out what your long lead times are, items are, and you start those first and you work through them, and you kind of take, when do I want to close, and you back into that, then some things go really quick and you can work on them simultaneously. But a lot of times this job to me is like a rush, a flurry before a phone call, because we have to show that we've done a lot of work and we've got the market study going, we've got this going. So you're sending a lot of emails and trying to check and follow up on things. And then you have a quiet period while reports are coming in and you're waiting for responses. But the other thing is, it looks intimidating, but most of the people that are in this industry really want to do good work in this industry. And if you're willing to ask questions, they will help you. So even when you get in a jam, like when I totally screwed up the closing by letting the contractor put fencing and stuff on, I was like, hey, I had no idea. What do I got to do to fix it? And they said, these are the steps you take, and you just go through the steps. And then, you know, something like that makes an impact. You generally don't make that mistake twice, but having a group of people, like my door is open. If anybody has questions and wants to contact me, I'm open to talking about stuff. But that's the way you learn, is by being able to communicate with other people who've been through it. No project is ever the same. You think that you have it all dialed in, and then the next project throws you a completely different curveball that you didn't anticipate. But don't be afraid of it. It's everybody wants to get the project done. So you just got to keep the communication open.
Yeah, I was just, right before you started talking about that, I was just thinking, it's so generous of Beth to come here and talk to us during this busy affordable housing time. But it is really nice. I mean, that is the nice thing about doing this kind of mission driven work, right? Is that we want to spread it, and we're not kind of like hoarding the resources. So, and we know that it can't get done by ourselves. So that is really, really generous. And I really love that a lot. And there's no school to go to be an affordable housing developer. So how else are we going to learn? Yeah. Where do you think we should go next? Does anybody have a highlighted item they want to talk about?
A lot of times, if you have a really good architect, they're going to help you with permitting. And so if you have an architect that's really experienced and has done some of this before, they can help. So again, that's part of having the team. If you can use your resources, and they can reach out and find out what the impact fees are, find out what those hookup fees are going to be, what your permit fees are going to be. They vary. I've had we have some bizarre experiences in rural Nevada I don't think you have this issue in Reno or Las Vegas or some of the bigger cities where, you know, we were in Tonopah and they didn't do permits. And so we had to go to the county and we had to ask them for the permits and the inspections, and we had to pay a fee to do the inspections. But it was a struggle trying to find who was going to review the documents. But in your bigger areas like Mesquite, we got hit with really big impact fees. There's a lot of sewer connection fees, water connection fees, meter fees. So you really do want to do your homework on that and make sure that that line item in your budget covers everything that's going to be included there. And it varies from locality to from municipality to municipality.
Beth, I'd add to that too. One of the ways that we're approaching a lot of our rehab is to have a construction manager on, like they bring the GC on early as a construction manager, like have a CMAR or these things, but that again to that team. And I know that like sometimes you're like, well, that's gonna be money, so I got to try to figure out a way to do that myself so that we can make this project work. And then I think all of our project would fall apart right now if we had skimped on any of the team that we have together on any of our projects. They wouldn't be moving forward. So I think trying to bootstrap your way through your first project or through really any project is probably just going to lead to more headaches versus building the right team and then figuring out how to pay for it with the different financing. They're both challenging. I would go the challenging route of finding the money versus the headache of trying to do a bunch of stuff yourself. Because that can kill your project pretty quickly.
We do pay a lot of architect and engineer fees upfront because you really do have to have there's no way to get around having your drawings before you close. You have to have that and you have to get through the permitting process. And like you said, it's exceptionally helpful to bring the GC on early, because if your general contractor is participating, what we often run into is one of the longest lead time items is getting our construction drawings and getting to our construction contract with the GC. So our GCs that work with us, they're not getting any pay through the pre-development part, but they do come on board early because it makes their job easier in construction. If we bring them on at the same, so as soon as we get awarded funds, so for example, if we're doing a 9% in July, when we get awarded funding, we immediately make our GC selection and have the GC come in and work with the architect, because a lot of times they can make suggestions on ways that the building can be built more efficiently. They may have different materials that we could use, and so they can help with the architect to make the plans more efficient and more cost effective. And then if they also know that you're looking at a lot of stuff that you want to do, but you can't quite fit it into the budget, there are things that can be added on to the back end of the construction project if you have extra money. So they can alternate those items out. So they come to you after you get a complete set of building plans. They can go out to bid and they can come back to you with a list of options that you can add or that you can delete out if you need to make adjustments in your budget to get to your closing. And the GC in our case doesn't get paid until they actually start doing construction after the financial close, but they're willing to participate with us in order to make the completed project work more seamlessly once they start construction, because they already have a better idea of what the plans are, what they're building, what our goals are, and they're used to working with the architect if it's a new team, and it makes the process easier. So we have to pay the architect up front, but our GC doesn't get paid till they actually start, but it just makes their life easier, if that makes sense.
I wonder if it might be good to talk a little bit about that permitting process, because I feel like that comes up a lot, right? Zoning, zone variances, getting planners to approve your projects, attending public meetings to get your project approved. Maybe that would be something we could talk about.
And some of that starts way early when you first start looking at your piece of dirt. You want to know what it's zoned for. And if it's not zoned for the use that you need, or if you look at a conceptual plan for it, it doesn't have enough parking, you might have to go back to the city or the county, and you might have to do like a special use permit, or you might have to do some sort of variance on the zoning. So you do want to look at that stuff early on and get your architect involved, because the architects can also help you with some of those zoning questions. And they can give you some nice conceptual plans so that if you have to go talk to the city or the county or stand before a commission meeting, you can at least show some pretty pictures of what you want to do and help get through that process. They're very helpful in that. And there are engineering firms that we've worked with that do a lot of special use permits. And it's, again, it's building that team of people that you can trust to help you get through these steps that you don't necessarily know how to do, but they can walk you through it.
And Beth, I'd add to like knowing the planning staff, right? Like not just getting to know who you're going to work with and establishing some rapport with them, so that, and some level of trust. I think, especially with affordable housing, I know like City of Reno and is looking at expediting review for affordable housing. They actually have some code amendments they might put in that provides more by right zoning for affordable housing. So as long as you meet like the basics of what the code requires, you can skip a lot of the process and just go straight to building permit versus doing some of the really cumbersome public hearing and reviews. So connecting with the development services staff at the City of Reno, the City of Sparks, I would encourage folks to do that, or having someone on your team who really understands that process, because again, you don't get an idea and build. And if you don't build the right timeline, then you cause a bunch of other problems.
Yeah, and you're right. There's so many places are looking for affordable housing. I know Carson City, we've talked to them a couple of times, and they were looking at how could they make their codes easier, how could they make adjustments to their building, to their planning codes and some of those things, so that they could make it easier for affordable housing to fit into certain areas. So it's definitely worth building that relationship with your local building department and county commissions or whoever, that so that you can understand that process. It can be complicated and it can take a lot of time. If you're having to go through a zoning change, you might have to go through 2 or 3 commission meetings, and those often are scheduled 2 to 3 to a month, 2 to 3 weeks to a month apart. So you definitely want to start that part early and know how that's going to fit into all of your approvals so that you can meet your dates.
What about the real estate attorney? I feel like this is one that I don't hear about very much, actually. Nobody really talks about their attorney in the circles that I'm moving through.
So in our experience, the attorney that we use is a specialist in tax credits, and they know how these agreements get put together. They understand about the vouchers and all of these aspects. So the amazing thing to me for an attorney is that the attorneys that we've used, they give us a proposal and they don't get paid till we close. And so they put in a lot of time, because there are a ton of documents that have to get signed in order to do one of these. You have your HAP agreement or your AHAP agreement for if you're doing vouchers. You have all of your developer agreements and your operating agreements that you're coordinating with your investor. You have construction loan documents. You have deeds. You have land use restriction. There are, I don't know how many pieces of paper have to get signed off to get one of these done, but your attorney should be someone that you know and trust, and because there is no way that I could read every single document that comes through. And so they are working on your behalf, and they are watching out for you, and they are following along. And then they're helping you get everything signed off, and they're helping you get this package put back together so that by the time you get through the closing, you have a complete package that has all of the appropriate versions with signatures of these documents. Because once you get into this and you get down to the very end of the process of pre-development, when you're getting close to closing, there are hundreds of documents, it seems like, that are flying around, and this attorney makes this change and that attorney, everybody has their own attorney, and so you want yours that's looking out for you, and they're all redlining these documents, and it's nearly impossible to keep track of which is the latest version. So your attorney is watching all of that and making sure that your signature pages get attached to the final version of that everybody has agreed to. And then they're hopefully putting a package together for you so that once it gets recorded and closed, they send you back a complete package of every document that was signed in relationship to this project so that you have good records.
Mhm.
But
That
they
sounds
don't get
super
paid till the
important.
end. They don't get paid till the end. It's crazy.
Yeah. That does sound very important. It's a very special skill to read through legal documents.
Yeah, and you
Um,
want to be able to call them and ask them questions and say, "Hey, I don't understand this." I've done that a lot. So find someone that you're comfortable working with who has experience in the area and has is open to answering your questions and helping you through it. Most of the ones I've worked with have been great.
Awesome. All right. Let's see. Wow.
Joanna, the one thing I'd throw in if on the impact fees,
Mhm.
and we kind of talked about this on the permits already, that one way to help a project is for it to be expedited through permitting. So again, knowing the process, knowing if the jurisdiction has like a concierge service, like they'll have a special team that works with you versus you having to kind of go through the normal process. The other thing that I know the city of Reno has done, I think they're putting it on pause for a little bit, but they have fee waivers for depending on if it's affordable. So knowing if your the jurisdiction where you're building has the ability to waive or hold off on deferring the payment of certain fees. Because if you have to pay those fees upfront, you have to have that money. But if you can wait till you get all your financing together and pay at the end, then it's easier to pay for those fees. But that's another thing of, and if you can get them waived, then it's basically you're reducing the cost of your project. So that's another place, I think, a key kind of pre-dev consideration in our projects. But
Yeah, reach out and ask because you don't know what they'll give you if you don't ask. And I mean, I wish I worked in a city like Reno because it sounds like you have a lot of cool stuff. A lot of the smaller entities that we deal with, Elko, Pioch, stuff like that, they don't necessarily have a concierge service, but they will have one person that you can contact and talk to and ask a lot of questions. And then keep in mind too, one thing that we do is we may pay the plan review fees upfront. So the city or the whoever is reviewing our plans, but we don't pay for the permit until after we close because your permit fees are going to be another fee that's a little bit higher. And if for some reason the deal fell apart at the last minute, you don't want to be sitting there out a lot of money for a permit that you can't use because you don't have any financing for your project. So that's again why some of these things come in at the end. So when we talk about permits, we submit the plans for permit and we get to a point where the building department will give us a letter that is a permit ready letter. And it basically says, we have reviewed the plans and they are approved and you can start construction once you pay XYZ in fees. And we can provide that letter to the financial people and close. And then our contractor will generally go in and pay the fees and get us started.
yeah, that's a really good point, Beth. And I'd add to thing that I got surprised by was it's like, oh yeah, it's just like the city, right? You go through it, but it's like, no, you also got to talk to your water authority, at least in Reno. You got to go through Tumwa, you have to get ElevateNV Energy involved. Sometimes you have to feel free, like you have to connect with a potential broadband provider, right? Like there's all these other, the utilities. We had a project where they weren't communicating and we had to adjust the setback with a sidewalk. And the ElevateNV Energy thought it was adjusting one way and Tumwa thought it was adjusting another. Or ElevateNV Energy thought we moved a fire hydrant and a light pole in the wrong direction because they had to like adjust those things. And then we ended up being like, neither of you are right. These are right in the middle of what the new sidewalk is going to be because they weren't coordinating. So knowing that was a huge learning curve of just everyone who's involved up front. That was a part that kind of got a bit dizzying. It was like, how many people have to do something before we can actually build this place? When do we actually start building the thing?
Yeah.
And you got to look at your connection fees. And a lot of times your investors will be asking you for will serve letter. So a will serve letter is something from all of those utilities that says we will service your project, and they want a letter stating that you're going to get that. And they can be hard to work with. Even in a town like Carson, we did a brand new construction building in Carson City, and we got will serve letters, but when it came down to it, we had the hardest time trying to get AT&T and Charter out while we had open ground where it was easy to put the trenches in. We had the hardest time getting them out there to provide service. And we actually ended up nobody would respond to any of our calls. We tried hundreds of different numbers and getting a hold of someone, and we ended up having the building built. And when we finally called to get the office set up for a phone number, that's when AT&T came out and said, oh, hey, this box out here has X number of lines, but only like 2 of them work. And we're like, what? Hey, man, we tried to call you. So start with that stuff early, because sometimes it can be difficult getting to the person you need to help you answer your question.
It sounds like building relationships is a really important part of getting development done. It sounds like having a good enough relationship with the folks in the housing department at the city or the counties or the utilities department, so you can call them and like they know who you are, and when your name pops up in their inbox, they know what that is, and they can, respond to the email instead of just scrolling past it. It makes me feel a lot better about the coalition and what we do. I'm like, oh, it seems like it's really important that we have a big conference where everyone's in the same room once a year. So I think that's really a awesome thing that's coming out of this conversation. I know we only have a few minutes left, so I don't want to, only spend time on my questions if anybody else has a question. But I'm just wondering, because you keep mentioning investors, and I know in a previous conversation I had with a developer down here, he was also talking about his guarantor, which is different from an investor. And I feel like we haven't really covered that at all. That those two roles really, and maybe that's not related to pre-development, but it seems important.
Well, the funny kind of thing is, so an investor they're gonna invest in your project, but the guarantor is often you, because you're guaranteeing that the project is going to get built and that it's going to get managed and occupied and stay in compliance. Especially when we're talking, I keep talking about tax credits because that's like probably the thing we've used the most, and one of the best ways to get your housing built. It's one of the easiest for us to use. So the investor is going to come in, but they are going to come in as the 0.99% owner of your LLC and your ownership entity, and you are the 0.01% owner. But all of the liability really falls on you, because if you are not maintaining the compliance, if you're not building the building according to what was agreed to, and you're not occupying it according to the rules with income and rent limits and stuff, if there is an issue down the road and the IRS decides that you've fallen out of compliance, they're going to go to the IRS is going to go to the investor, and they're going to lose their credits. And then the investor is going to come back to you and say, you guaranteed and you sponsored this project, and they're going to want their money back. And so we never want that to happen. And we haven't had anything like that happen, but that is the big, bad, ugly thing in the room, because you're basically guaranteeing that all of these things that you've committed to are going to get done, and they're going to stay in compliance for number one, the period of compliance for the tax credits, and then number two, for the period of affordability, because often that's much longer. When you're going through your project, you may be committing to NHD that you're going to have an extended period of affordability.
So for the most part, when we're talking about investors, it's our tax credit investors. So you get your investors through the tax credit program, because that's how most affordable housing gets built, right?
Yes.
And then your guarantor is often you, but if you're an emerging developer, you might have like a private investor that is your guarantor, like a private rich friend or something.
Right. Or a sponsor to the project, or some other partnership that you're building. In our case, it's always been us, but there are partnerships out there.
I would say too, guarantors are also, if your project has debt, there might be a guarantor who's attached to the loan versus the tax credit equity. So that could be what that person's talking about. And then tax credits are weird, right? Just to do a tax credit deal, you have to have done one before, right? Like you can't actually apply for it or qualify unless you've actually completed one. So there's this weird, like, how do you get in? And then sometimes you're gonna get in with that guarantor or sponsor who has tax credit experience and lets you apply and get into the funding pool.
Awesome. Any final questions from the folks in the room? Do you have any burning pre-development interests that haven't been addressed yet? I'm learning to wait longer in silence, so.
Beth, did we miss anything? Is there any big pre-dev thing that you feel like wasn't covered?
No, I think we did. I think we covered a lot of the areas where I've had issues before.
I really like this kind
It
of
is a
casual
lot about
conversation.
collaboration is good, and building your team of resources, and you know, having someone that you can call on to ask questions, and basically not being afraid to ask questions is big.
Yeah. And it sounds like troubleshooting is like a really big part of development, since no process is ever the same, no project is ever the same, right? So I think it sounds like, you know, you're doing a new thing with every project, so you might come up against new barriers every single time, and you'll have to learn that skill of troubleshooting problems and problem solving and how to get answered.
That's what makes it fun.
Well, thank you so much, Beth. I really appreciate you sharing your time and expertise with us today. It makes a huge difference. I think, you know, overall, even if we don't all become developers or work at development organizations, just being advocates of affordable housing, it's really important for us to know the process and know especially how complex it can be. So thank you so much for taking the time today. I will send out an email, everybody, with some follow-up stuff, and I'm really excited for next month when we're in person, and we're going to be talking more in depth about managing construction with the Reno Housing Authority team.
Me too. Thank you very much, Beth. This was really, really helpful. You answered a lot of questions that I had, so thank you. This is Juliana.
Oh, I can stop sharing now, I guess. Woo. There we go. Well, I hope you guys have a wonderful week. Please reach out if you have any questions, and I'll see you soon. Thank you again, Beth. Thank you, JD.